To section 1. And the big idea here is that all of the giant political and economic institutions that help us in our lives have a purpose. And the purpose is to help us as individuals and us as a group of people to accomplish our goals. And so some of the terms you'll see, we're going to get into a little bit of history today. Enlightenment. What are some of the big picture ideas that our country is based on? But also we'll get into some of the British history here with what a monarchy looks like and in terms of common law and natural rights and some of the basis of the theories that became the United States government. And then finally I'll try to provide some operational definitions for terms. First off, rhetorical question. Our country is based on the idea that we have inalienable rights. I love the phrasing of the Declaration where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And that literally means evident based on reason. Self-evident. They're just true because they are. That all are created equal and endowed from their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Those rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is really just a paraphrasing of John Locke, who said life, liberty, and property.
If you don't own it, then you're not happy.
Yeah, well, the idea, it gets kind of philosophical from there, that property is what you possess, that your ownership of that entitles you to pursue happiness with that in your own way. If you own that truck, you can drive that truck like a banshee. That's yours to pursue happiness with. If you have that house and it's your prerogative to paint it purple, knock yourself out. That's your way of pursuing happiness, is a purple house. Who am I to tell you not to? Okay, so who the influencers of the colonial government? Really, a lot of these ideas go back to the Enlightenment, and it's a term that historians slap onto a period of time. Because some very influential thinkers like John Locke and Rousseau and Descartes and Montesquieu, all of these big names began to write and kind of organize these thoughts around the concept of natural rights. Natural rights. The fact that Khan, as a human being, has natural rights, and that transcends any government. And it is really the purpose of a government to protect those rights. And if a government fails to protect those rights, it has violated its social contract and it has nullified its right to be a government. Now, those ideas are old, but the phrasing of those ideas is new. That idea that a government is involved in a contract with the people, the consent of the governed. It's a wonderful topic. The Chinese had a concept that dates back for thousands of years called the mandate of heaven, that the ruler of China is endowed by the Creator with the right to rule. However, if that ruler becomes corrupt and fails his people, he loses the mandate of heaven, and it is the job of the people to overthrow and kill that ruler. So, in a way, it's a social contract. However, it doesn't really establish a great system for a transition of power. And so China has a history of violent revolutions resulting in overthrows of governments. And that's why you have the various dynasties that you do in Chinese history. And so the Enlightenment was a new way to think about this. Meanwhile, England was ruled by monarchs. That is, king or queen. They still have a monarchy, though, as you know, the monarchs are really empty titles. They still serve an important symbolic role. The English monarchy is still revered. World leaders still go and meet with the Queen. I mean, our president went and met with the Queen of England not too long ago over the summer. It is
Didn't
still.
look very happy about it.
Well, I like how he walked in front of her, and that offended the British people. You're not supposed to do that. So even though the king and queen have no real power, they still have a lot of symbolic authority and are still individuals to be treated with respect. But a lot of the true power of the monarchy began to fade with the passage of the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta did guarantee certain individual rights for all. But it was also a coup d'etat from the nobles. You see, the nobility, the powerful, the landed gentry, the 1% in England really resented the fact that the king had all of this power over them, even though they had all of this wealth and power themselves. And so you got a couple options. You go back to the feudalism and constant warfare of the Middle Ages. That nobody wants that. And if we're going to have a nation, then there needs to be an effective balance of power between the nobles and the king and the commoners. And so that's where the Magna Carta was quite brilliant. It did guarantee these protections and certain rights for all landholders, but importantly limited power for the monarchs and established the precedent of equal treatment under the law for all British subjects, not just the rich landholders, not just the king, but the common people. And that's where we get the idea that if you get in trouble, you have the right to tell your side of the story formally in a court, and for that side of your story to be heard by your peers of your choosing. Now, there's two parties, the accuser and the defense, that select the jurors that will hear and try the case, but you have the right to be a part of that selection so that you know if you're in trouble and you know that Naomi is really angry about you for some reason, well, then you have the right to point that out and say she should not be on my jury. She's angry with me for something, and so she could not hear my case objectively because her preconceived notion of me, because I like spilled coffee on her one morning or something, and so she's going to be angry at me. She's not going to be able to hear my case objectively. Now, this also established Parliament as the legislature. The legislature is a group of people that makes the laws. Whereby previously kings had ruled by decree, they could make a law, poof, and it's the law. The Magna Carta established the body of Parliament. And it is the job of Parliament to make the laws. And so, even though the Magna Carta is just a document, and even though in terms of changing the culture, we still have a long ways to go because the landed gentry of England still saw themselves certainly as better than those peasants, but the document established the principle of equality. A balance of power, even, between Parliament, which originally was just the nobles, but eventually the common people will get a say when the House of Commons was created, which is why we have a bicameral legislature. So the U.S. Senate was meant to represent the nobility, 2 per state, so they represent the state as a whole. Each state gets 2 votes. The House of Representatives is much like the House of Commons in Parliament. They represent us. When we are bugging our guest speakers to come, I'm not going to hold my breath for Tom Tillis. He's our U.S. Senator. It's unlikely that he will appear in this room because he represents the entire state. We were able to get a representative of his, an intern who works in Hendersonville, nice guy. He came to speak with us, but that's probably the best we'll get. Mark Meadows, he owes us. He's going to either come here or Skype with us personally. So that's because he's our common person's representative. Now this is big. It is. It's a huge change. And that's why we call it a revolution. Revolution just means big change. And the big change here is that no ruler had more power than Parliament. Also along with this is the English Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments in our Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. And those are the rights and protections that you have from the government. From the government. Okay. Also the idea of common law. Common law means law that applies to everyone, commoners and nobles alike. And it's a system of law based on precedent and custom. Precedent means that if we have established a precedent in this class of no electronic devices during lessons, and you guys are doing great with it, that's a precedent. That means it's worked in the past, it's going to continue to work, and I appreciate your cooperation. Custom means an unspoken guideline. You know, you all walked in here and you all sat down. Thanks. It gets awkward if you're all standing. But that's a custom. You all walked in and you sat down. And that's a custom. But you know what? It's an effective custom. Because it's really awkward if we're all standing. I mean, it's awkward if I'm sitting while I'm teaching, at least to me. But it's also awkward if we're all standing. So we just have that custom. You all walk in, you sat down, we never talked about it, it just sort of happened. And that's kind of how law works. There are certain customs, you know, that are what we call societal norms that effectively serve as law. I mean, there is a law about public indecency. You know, you wore clothing today, thank you. And again, that's also a custom. It's just something we do. And that's how common law works. So, to define these a little more formally, precedent is a ruling, and that is used as the basis for a judicial decision in a later similar case. The fancy Latin term for this is stare decisis, which means literally, let the decision stand. It's how the Supreme Court works. That, you know, for example, the Tinker Standard defines acceptable school expression as non-disruptive and not harmful. If you're not hurting anyone and you're not disrupting the flow of class, whatever, right? You know, it's just like if I decided to dye my hair blue. I mean, that's my right to do so. If I'm not hurting Bailey by dyeing my hair blue, then okay. If we decide it's disruptive to class, well, we'll have to figure that. It's a case by case. You know, maybe in dyeing my hair blue, it somehow offends Alyssa's religious sensibilities, and she's got a tenet somewhere about blue hair. Okay. Then I would have to be sensitive to that because that might be harmful to her sensibilities, and that might eventually be an assault on her in some way. I mean, again, those are case by case, but that's the Tinker Standard. That's the precedent that was established in that case. Now, common law is also based on court decisions. You know, we've got three branches of government involved in law. There is the executive. They enforce the laws. And they can, in some cases, rule by decree with executive order, and we'll get into the details of that. It is the exclusive job of Congress to make laws. But also laws are based on interpretation. Because once more, we know we have the right to free speech. That was actually developed by Congress in the Bill of Rights many years ago. But the question is, what is speech? You know, to what degree is internet? You know, of course, in the digital age, we've got to redefine speech, don't we? You know, what is assault? To what degree is cyberbullying assault? You know, when I troll someone online just to like push their buttons and get them angry, where's the line to that? You know,
The line is when you hack their password.
Yeah, I mean, to what point am I causing harm by trolling someone? At what point is that harmful in a court of law? I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And so, once more, that's how law works. Okay, a couple important people that we need to know about. You probably already know about John Locke. Of course, he argued that people had natural rights. Those are freedoms that we possess relating to life, liberty, and property. Natural rights that we have regardless of what country we live in. He also believed that a government's purpose was to be a social contract. You know, for example, as your teacher, I promise to do the best I can to be your teacher. That's my job. But I also promise not to be disrespectful toward you or to make you feel threatened by my behavior. I mean, that's the social contract we have. If I'm, we always think of like one of the big buzzwords in education now is microaggression. You know, teachers really do get like rattled over the years, and we can be sometimes mean to students without intending to, and we can, like, when we are that grumpy, we'll figure out like how far we can push it without crossing the line. That's called microaggression. It's not cool. It's not good of me to do that. Sometimes I do get upset with you guys, and I'm trying to like deal with things calmly, but sometimes I can be like that guy, and that could be a violation of my social contract, is I'm being mean to you even though I'm not meaning to. And so in that case, yeah, just like anybody else, I'd owe you an apology. And I found myself in that position several times in my career. It happens. You know, just like you guys in your friendships and dealing with people, like occasionally you do cross that line. And that's a social contract in a friendship too, is that you're not going to hurt that person. But that's life. Occasionally you will hurt that person. You will violate that social contract, and you have an obligation to that person to make it right. And that's just how. And, obviously that's common sense, but I like that John Locke formalized it. Montesquieu's ideas were all about the separation of powers. You know, I try to be a fair teacher, but I appreciate that I have accountability. You know, if I had no accountability, it would be tempting to say, man, it's Friday, I'm sleepy. My son had me up at 4, and let's just watch a movie, and I'm going to take a nap. You know, with no accountability, that little temptation would always be there. I'd like to think that I would still try to be a good teacher for you guys, but again, the accountability is helpful. And so that's a separation of power. I don't have absolute power over you. I mean, I don't. I shouldn't. There are limitations to my power, and you guys are holding me accountable just as anyone else would. You know, if I, decided to enforce behavior by, like, Alyssa sneaking and texting, wham! You know, that would be inappropriate. It would also be assault. And not only would I lose my job, but I would be arrested. So, yeah, I just say that because she's sweet. So when I pick on you guys, it's because I know that you're sweet. And anyway,
Is that why you never pick on me?
Oh, Lauren, well, just wait, it's coming. Okay, so the idea here is that these philosophical ideas, what we can really call common sense, provided the framework for the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And I think that's the cool thing about it, is that when we really dig in, and you don't have to memorize the Constitution in this class, but you will be exposed to all the amendments, and hopefully they will stick in some way. I hope you go through them and you're like, yeah, that's obvious. That's a good thing. That's a good thing when you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Because occasionally rules are passed where we're like, that's stupid. And the good news is, if a rule is passed that's really out of line, it probably violates something in the Constitution. And obviously Congress doesn't have the right to do that. Okay, so the biggest influence in shaping the American government, again, a matter of interpretation. The fact is that all of these points served as a bit of influence, foundational. But of course, the idea of self-government, limited government, is huge in our Constitution. There's an entire amendment, the 10th Amendment, that if it is not specifically stated in this document, live your life. And it's really there. There's a whole amendment for that if we didn't say it, it's live your life. Do what you think's right. The Constitution doesn't say who you need to be interested in. It doesn't say this is who you need to be friends with or this is who you need to connect with romantically. It doesn't. Live your life. It does say don't hurt other people, obviously. But that's the idea of liberalism. And I'm not talking about the liberalism as like liberal versus conservative. But liberalism literally means live and let live. As long as your actions are not hurting others, you're all right with me. Now, England originally established colonies, 13 colonies in what is today the United States. And a colony is a group that is still under the guise of a mother country. All they've done is said, hey, this group of people wants to move over here. They want to still call themselves British. They still need help from the British. Fair enough. California is considering breaking up into 3 states. Did you guys know that? Yeah. So, fun fact, they may become 3 states at some point in their lifetime. They're not going to secede from the United States. They still want to remain under the guise and protection of the United States, but they no longer want to be considered one giant state. And they're huge. There's 30 million people there, so I guess I get it. What they're trying to say is that X number of representatives cannot effectively represent 30 million people. Fair enough. Now, Jamestown was the earliest of these colonies, and it has a neat story. It was a joint stock company. That is, it was a corporation. The Company of Jamestown, a for-profit enterprise, said, we're going to send some people to the New World. Let's dredge up whoever wants to go there, doesn't mind living there and dealing with the risk. Who wants to go? Show of hands. Okay, great. Awesome. Vaughn, you're on the Jamestown team. Yay, Vaughn. You're hopping on the boat, free pass, moving to this place, which turned out to be a swamp, and it was gross, and half the people died of swamp-related diseases. But he's going to take his chances and hopefully get us started. Now, the big goal, of course, is to generate revenue for Jamestown. They've got to find something that's going to make that place profitable because they're being funded by a corporation. Well, Jamestown had the authority to set up a colonial government, which was really a form of self-government. Because the Company of Jamestown knew they could not effectively govern this place that was so far away. I mean, if you've watched Avatar, the humans in Avatar that were attempting to colonize the planet, they were a joint stock company. They had the obligation to their corporate board to generate a profit, which was whatever the stuff they were mining was. They found profit in that. They had to mine that stuff. Ergo, it brought them into conflict with the natives, because the natives happened to live on top of the stuff they were trying to mine. Bottom line, though, that company had the right to figure out what was profitable on that planet and how to generate that profit, which sparked a conflict, which, again, the company didn't necessarily tell them to do, but it gave them the mandate that they had to generate revenue. Jamestown found the same story. In fact, in a lot of ways, Avatar was based on the story of Jamestown. Because when Jamestown was created, they had the obligation to generate profit. Just so happened there were some natives in the way of that. It's not their fault, they were just living there, but they were in the way of the profit revenue for Jamestown, and it created conflict. Each colony has a different story, though, and I'm not going to go into all of them. But Plymouth, what is today Boston, has a neat story as well. April showers bring what? Mayflowers, and Mayflowers bring pilgrims. Yeah. So Boston was established by a group of people fleeing religious persecution, pilgrims. They came to what is today the United States. They came to Plymouth Rock to establish a religious community. They were Puritans, like super hardcore fundamentalists, basically. And they set up the Mayflower Compact. Compact is just a legal term for a contract or an agreement among a group of people. And the Mayflower Compact was signed by the men of the colony, whereupon they agreed to set up a government that would make just laws and a system of direct democracy, because they were a small colony. But here's the catch. Only the white landholding men got to be a part of this. So it's really not a direct democracy. We could call this an oligarchy, if you will, a rule by a small group of people claiming to represent the others. But whatever. So the Mayflower Compact is a version of self-government. All of their big decisions would be developed at town meetings, where all of the men of the colony would come. Every man had a voice, and they could propose something. And it's an interesting form of government, but it works in small groups. And this was even where the Constitution comes in. Now, the government of these 13 colonies depended on the situation. In some cases, the governors were elected by colonists, or in the case of New Jersey, it was a royal colony, meaning the governor was appointed actually by the king. Lawmakers would be elected from among the free adult males. And, the cool thing about this is even the British government, and they had had a history of colonialism, they understood the importance of limited rule. Is that if you are going to set up a colony 10,000 miles away from the mother country, you're going to have to trust the people to a certain degree. I mean, you can send over captains of your army to be governors, but they've got to work with the people that are there. And there has to be that level of trust that goes along with self-government. And so, as time went on, Jamestown was... I've already forgotten. Mid-1600s. And then from that time in the mid-1600s up until the mid-1700s, there was this 100-year period where the British government was just working with the colonies. And it was business as usual. And the British government just kind of trusted the colonies. Now, town hall meetings, once more, can be effective in small groups. The bigger the group, the trickier it gets. And that's all I've got for today.